Hi, Sam.
Hey, Bob, how you doing?
I can't complain. How are you?
All right.
Let me
In the strangest of times.
It is strange. We're going to talk about the strangest of times. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show. You are Sam Tanenhaus. You've been with us once before, many months ago, kind of at the beginning, when people were just starting to take Donald Trump seriously, I think, as a possible nominee back then. I forget when exactly it was, but I know we talked about him, among other things. And now we're going to talk about him a lot, in part because you've written a piece about him in the Prospect, where you're going to have a column during the campaign season. Prospect magazine, I mean, the British Prospect.
The British, not the American
Not
one.
the American. In fact, I noticed in your latest piece about Trump, you took pains to have sentences saying things like, the elections for Congress are held on the same day as the election for president. You might not have felt the need to convey that information had it been the other Prospect.
That's it, yeah. And then they put in all those fancy British spellings. And sometimes those explanatory additions are theirs. I find it interesting, to write about our politics, especially at this very odd moment, for readers who aren't living here. It's a good exercise.
Yeah, it is. The only thing I don't like is the way they invert the dates. Instead of saying August 9th in your piece, they say 9th August, and it just throws me. I have to put the thing down and reorient myself.
That's it, yeah.
So, anyway, let me say a little more about you, because so much of your background is actually relevant to this. You've been a kind of a scholar of conservative thought. You wrote a very well-regarded biography of Whittaker Chambers. More recently, you wrote a book called, I think, The Death of Conservatism, which we may come to believe was prescient. We'll see. You also co-edited, I discovered, a book on McCarthyism in America, and that is, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the connection between Joseph McCarthy's appeal and Donald Trump's appeal.
Well, let me say something first about that, Bob, just for full disclosure. That was a series of talks, some of them very interesting, given at, I think it was the Library of Congress, it might have been the Smithsonian, not so long ago, by a range of people, but the book was never published.
It was never published?
No,
it's in your Wikipedia. Well, don't take it out of your Wikipedia entry. It's
there.
I
know. Somehow it landed there, and every now and again I hear from people about it. Doug Brinkley really organized it and asked me to help him because of the Chambers book. And there were many interesting presentations made, but no one ever did the work to put it into a book. Maybe we should now, though. We'd have to dig up all the papers.
Well, there really are interesting comparisons between and contrasts between McCarthy's appeal and Trump's appeal. Now, in your Prospect piece, which is alluringly titled Donald Trump, the American Nihilist, you talk about George Wallace as a comparison.
Right. I've also written, however, about the McCarthy comparison. So I did that. My one and only, my first, I hope, because I loved writing for them, piece for the Progressive, which was relevant because, it's published in Madison, and they were an early publication kind of keeping an eye on McCarthy.
Yeah, very much. So let's start out with the nihilism part. In what sense is Donald Trump a nihilist?
All right, well, what I did there, I feel as if I'm confessing rather than conversing, is I drew that directly and with full attribution from the great Gary Wills in his book Nixon Agonistes, a Bible of mine, as my friends and students, when I have them, get very tired of hearing, can tell you about it. In that book, which is about the 1968 campaign, you remember it very well, it's a brilliant exegesis of Nixon and conservatism and liberalism, a book that gets more important every year. He also wills, because he came out of the conservative movement, which people don't realize today. They see these very leftish-sounding essays in the New York Review of Books. But in fact, he was a protege of Bill Buckley. And Gary saw early on that the real threat to American democracy was not coming from the SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society. It was more likely to come from someone like Wallace, because Wallace tapped into this sense of real alienation from the country. Now, Bob, here's an interesting difference, and you jump in at any point because I tend to filibuster. The point Gary makes in that book, where he also writes at length about Sturl Agnew, remember him, is that they were great upholders of the establishment in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
Agnew very proudly identified with the establishment. The establishment then meant authorities, meant the police, it meant the military, it meant the church and the family, all these values. What's interesting about Trump is he represents this phase of rebellion among very similar voters, and we know who many of them are, though it's a mistake to describe them too narrowly. But Trump supporters, if we'll agree that they are waging a kind of cultural war against American politics, against its establishment, are against it. They don't feel as if they're a part of the establishment anymore. And that's the change that's happened, I think. The establishment, although the term liberal establishment was used back then, that establishment itself was still in many ways conservative. Now, the view of a supporter not only of Donald Trump, but of Ted Cruz, I think, of many Republican candidates would say, no, the establishment's run by the liberals now. It's run by the New York Times editorial page, or by think tanks, liberal-minded think tanks, or the Harvard Faculty Club, or whatever.
Yeah, although a point you're kind of making implicitly in the prospect piece is that really it's all one establishment in the sense, left, right, liberal, conservative, because you see now that when elites come under attack collectively, they band together. You have this line in the piece, it's impossible to read the nation's great dailies, New York Times and Washington Post, and not sense a shudder, the sign of a new, if fleeting, unity. Between, the nation, National Review, it's like the phrase you use is all our differences seem to have been set aside in the collective effort to quarantine Trump. So he is a threat to the establishment in a very broad and not all that ideological sense, right? And and to my mind, he raises the prospect of whether the phase of kind of elite control may be drawing to an end.
Yes, I think you're right. I wrote another piece for Prospect after Obama gave his speech. I was in Philadelphia for the Democratic National Convention. And like everyone else, I was dazzled. He's a brilliant orator, rhetorically so impressive and persuasive, as rhetoric is supposed to be. But afterward, I realized, wow, he has just said Donald Trump is not, I'm paraphrasing, the usual or normal Republican or conservative. Mm-hmm. Boy, if I'm Paul Ryan on January 21st or whatever that date is going to be, when the next administration starts under, let's say, President Hillary Clinton, and I'm ready to oppose everything the new President Clinton says, then my reply will be, well, wait a minute. Because remember, Obama had a famous exchange with Eric Cantor, where he supposedly said, Eric, we won. I won the election. The reply this time will be, yeah, but you didn't beat us. Huh. You beat the Republican Party. You didn't beat conservatives. You beat the nut who got there instead.
Yeah, but the nut beat the conservatives first. So.
He whooped them, as Muhammad Ali would say. Yeah. He whooped them. He whooped 16 of them, one after another. It's like a Disney cartoon. He's Popeye. He's each one of them, in succession. He dominated that field. And that's what makes you think, I agree with you, that maybe we are seeing some kind of not quite disappearance, but remission of our elites because they've gotten so far out of touch.
Yeah.
And Trump got that. Say what you like, or as Paul Krugman would say, what you don't like. He's done it. He's really connected. So did Bernie, by the way.
Yeah, as was much remarked upon during the primaries. They were both you call Trump the anti-politician. They were both kind of the anti or the unpolitician. They were, and I've been saying for decades that politicians seem to have become so increasingly kind of plastic, manufactured, poll tested that I've always thought there was an opening for somebody who just came off as just authentic, period, regardless of what they said. And there have been glimpses of that. Like, I thought Paul Tsongas, if you remember him, he was such a bad candidate that I think people found that briefly appealing. He came close. He came close to picking up enough momentum to maybe win the Democratic nomination in, I think, 1992. He was a threat to Clinton for a while, as I recall.
Didn't he? Well, he won in New Hampshire, right?
Yes, and he... And he, I think he claimed that it was only through some pretty dishonest tactics that Clinton pulled out. I think it was Florida that turned the momentum. No, maybe it was Maryland. Something turned the momentum around. But he was like a totally bad candidate by all objective criteria, right? He was not inspired. He was just nothing. But his shtick was he told you the truth. He kept saying, "I'm not Santa Claus. We have a problem here." It was the budget deficit or something. But he was saying something other politicians just weren't saying. And he seemed just too unlike a politician to doubt him.
Well, for a while, you'll remember Jerry Brown had that in 1976. And then Brown tried to do it again. And at that point, he'd been himself in politics too long to do it. Turned out to be a brilliant politician. You know, someone's going to write a great biography of Jerry Brown.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's right, that there's an opening for the anti-politician. I hate to do one of these pretending to be out in the world pieces. Though I did go to a Trump rally in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. But when I first started to wonder what might be happening was when the electrician came to our house. We were living here in the wilds of Connecticut, Middlesex, Connecticut, about 20 minutes from Middletown, in a town called Essex. And we bought this house and we had to fix things up. And the electrician came over to do a lot of work, and he was interested in politics. This was a year ago. We started talking about it, and I asked him about Rubio. He's a liberal, which is not what you always encounter out here. Yeah, liberals and conservatives alike. But he was a liberal, Charlie, his name is, but he was fascinated by the Republican debates because they had just begun. And so he was watching them, as most of us did, as entertainment. And he said his wife was really excited by Trump, and he wasn't. And so we were running through the names, and I was just beginning the column for Prospect, and I also write sometimes for Bloomberg, and I'm trying to pick up what I can. And I asked him about Rubio, Marco Rubio, because I'd done a big piece, no one will remember, thankfully, for the New York Times Sunday magazine about 2 years ago on what would then be called the Reformicons, the reform conservatives who looked like they were the future. So intellectuals were people like Yuval Levin, who edits National Affairs. They're wonderful, bright, interesting people. Ramesh Ponnuru, a bright, really interesting economist named Michael Strain at the American Enterprise Institute. And I interviewed Rubio, interviewed him in his office. First time I'd ever met a senator. And he was extremely bright. You know, later he got exposed, I suppose. But he had command of all this stuff. He knew a lot of policy thinkers and writers and papers and all the rest. And he was really impressive, and he became kind of the star of the story I wrote. It was a big piece in the Sunday Times magazine. I think it was called, it had text on the cover, "Can the GOP be the party of ideas?" or something like that. And the idea, my idea, a lot of people at that time were so sick of all the obstructionism of the Tea Party. We do not want to hear any more about Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin and people like that. Here are the intellectuals. Here are the people who will reform conservatism, right? Yeah. So, and so I was much taken with Rubio. So I asked Charlie, this was, before the famous meltdown, long before then, probably about a year ago now. So what do you think of Rubio? Instantly dismissed him. He said, too slick. It had not occurred to me. But now it seems so obvious. And here was a guy, a very smart guy, but not somebody in the business like me. He's not sitting there, reading Breitbart and writing columns and all of this. And he says, too slick, too much the insider.
Right.
And then it made me realize, wow, I've got to look at all this really differently because I'm seeing it through those eyes.
Yeah. So he turned out, to have exactly diagnosed the problem with all candidates other than Trump in the primary. In a certain sense, they all seemed like politicians.
Yeah.
Well, with a couple of exceptions who were so hopeless that we were never going to hear of them again. But Trump didn't, and that was a big part of his appeal. Now, as for the Republicans becoming the party of ideas, which clearly is not going to happen this year, at least not as embodied in this nominee, Is that kind of what you now mean by calling Trump a nihilist? In other words, there are no ideas here. All there are is a cry of protest and anger and rage. Is that?
Yes. Although I will add something we leave out. First, I'm going to make a disclaimer that will seem odd, but I actually think this is a great period for our democracy, if not for our two parties. And I know very few agree with me.
I would write that column fast. Not that I think it's in danger of being scooped by anybody else, to be honest. But it's counterintuitive. Let me put it that way.
No, but I wrote a piece. The Times Book Review asked me to do a kind of a roundup of a lot of books that were coming out on populism. So I did this endless piece for them. It's good for them. It fills a lot of space. That ran, I think, in July. And when I did it, I went back and looked at some of the earlier populist upsurges. And I was most struck by 1936, right, which is Father Coughlin and Huey Long. And you could roughly say Coughlin equals Trump, and maybe Huey Long is kind of Trump plus Bernie Sanders. And so I reread Alan Brinkley's book, Voices of Protest. And one of the points he made, which is about Coughlin and Long and that moment during the Great Depression when it looked as if there might be some kind of upheaval. And Arthur Schlesinger writes about this too in his great cycle on the New Deal. But one of the points Alan makes, and his is a revisionist history, really revising Schlesinger, is that for the supporters of Long and Coughlin, they saw hope. They were excited and stimulated by these candidates. They don't show up to the rallies like brown shirts ready to beat people up. And I think one of my reservations about some of the coverage we're seeing of Trump is it tends to emphasize that. One reason I like George Saunders' piece in the New Yorker so much is he showed you all the different skirmishes, left and right, that occur, and also Dave Eggers' piece on going to a Trump rally, which is more like my own experience. It feels like an old rock concert. Hey, the Who are back in town. Let's put on our T-shirts and go out and hear them again. And in fact, you hear old Rolling Stone songs and Elton John, and they slip in Creedence Clearwater, and you look around and you see a lot of bald heads and ponytails and this kind of thing. And I'm not sure it's just anger and rage, is what I'm saying. Now,
although that's first, let me get clear on whether I'm correctly understanding your use of the term nihilism in your prospect piece, because I kind of took it to mean that. In other words, there's not a positive program here. He's not even in favor of the things you'd think somebody with his base might be in favor of, like raising the minimum wage. Nobody, I think you suggest that even many of his followers don't really think he's got some magic solution. They're just, and I know we don't want to oversimplify, and I certainly agree with you that the coverage of his base has been insufficiently nuanced and in a way insufficiently respectful. But that said, a lot of it is just that they're really pissed off. And they're kind of pissed off at people like you and me, among many other people that they imagine as being on our team, right?
Well, yes. No, I agree. All I want to add is that the mood and the atmosphere is surprisingly festive. And I spoke to Wright, young journalist. You've probably seen his work. Came over, very nicely introduced himself, because they're both alumni at Grinnell College. Very few journalists have gone to. And he said, well, I wanted to meet the other Grinnell graduate. His name is Ben Jacobs. He's been writing a lot for The Guardian, and he has a zillion followers on Twitter. One of these brilliant new journalists. And you and I are doing the best we can, but these are the people who own the game now. And he was telling me about Trump's playlist and how it's put together and all this. And I said, boy, are these rallies always like this? And he said, well, a lot of them are. He had been to 70 of them. And he said some of them are like tailgating parties. He said if you go to the Deep South, to a Trump rally outdoors, he said you'll see guys like pounding the beers in the parking lot. And so all I'm adding is that there is a sense of kind of unity and solidarity that those who attend the rallies have, and it's not just about the people they hate. Now, it's true, as soon as Hillary's name is mentioned, they go nuts. It's also true, as I wrote in the piece, Bob, and I don't know if you've been to a Trump rally, he doesn't say anything.
Right.
Eggers and George Saunders mentioned it too. No. He says nothing.
He just riffs about himself and the same themes. I mean, lately, he's now shifting, maybe we'll get to this, possibly into a different mode where he actually reads a speech. But I know, I've seen him on TV. It's just, he just totally ad-libs. And it's kind of surprising that people sit still for very long, because if they've seen him on TV, they're not going to hear anything new. Well,
that's what I was going to say, is that people start to drift out.
Yeah.
They're there because they want to have the experience.
Yeah.
It's like, all right, Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, have like found a new drummer. They're coming to town one last time, or the Kinks are reunited. Let's go hear them. It's almost that atmosphere, and after about 20 minutes, people's eyes start to glaze, and Trump himself sounded bored.
Yeah.
It seemed to me that he was going through the motions. We're in a gym, in a domed gym, in a very prosperous-looking high school in the suburbs, and which people should keep in mind when they're wondering, who's voting for Trump. Now, they come from all over the state. But you've seen, like, the Vox or 538 data on it. The incomes are actually a little higher than most of the country. They're lower than for the typical
$72,000 median income.
That's
a Trump supporter, which is
that's not a ton of money.
But it's not. But it's also not poverty.
It's not poverty, and it's more than most people make.
It's not. It's not what you think of when you think of Appalachia. Although the term Appalachia is very often invoked in describing his base.
Well, yes, and I do think J.D. Vance in that interesting new book is on to something.
Hillbilly Elegy is the book.
Yes, that's right. Bob, alas, we kind of remember the old, or at least remember hearing about the old Kerner Commission report, the two Americas, one black, one white. Mm-hmm. Now what we have is two Americas, one white and one non-white. Because what's striking about the event I went to in Mechanicsburg, Hillary had spoken, it's a suburb of Harrisburg, and Hillary had spoken there a week before at the Broad Street Market, which is this kind of cool, hip, downtown place. It's the capital city, and before a very diverse crowd. Mechanicsburg, which is outside the city, is not only not at all African American. Everybody there practically is white. I mean, you can count on two hands among, say, 3,000 or 4,000 people who aren't white. And that is that cultural shift, And that's what part of the George Wallace thing was about. Mm-hmm. Joe McCarthy's a little different if you want to get to him, though I do think there are parallels, and I've written about that too. McCarthy was a guy who got people excited, but also had no program. He never ran.
Well, rooting communists out of government. I mean, here's the difference I'd see between Wallace and McCarthy. With Wallace, it was very transparent that a certain amount of the appeal, or at least superficially, it certainly seemed a certain amount of appeal had to do with sheer bigotry, with and resentment of and dislike of elites, pointy-headed bureaucrats, I think was his phrase. Now, with McCarthy, most ostensibly, it was kind of a fear-based thing. There are communists in your closet, and we'll root them out, but the academic analysis of McCarthy, at least certain schools of it, tended to focus more on resentment of elites, right? That was one thesis about McCarthy, is that it was actually related to anti-intellectualism and resentment of East Coast elites and so on, that a lot of his appeal was that. Whereas with Wallace, that was much more on the table, right? I mean, that was, with McCarthy, it's a little more conjectural. I guess I'm suggesting there's a more obvious connection between Trump and Wallace, and a more debatable or conjectural connection between Trump and McCarthy. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think that's right. With McCarthy, the connection to the elites is a little more direct than that, because the speech that put him on the map was the one he gave at to the West Wheeling West Virginia Club. It was a Lincoln Day speech. McCarthy was the bottom-ranking senator. He ends up in Wheeling, But the famous lines, which actually are more or less cribbed from a speech Richard Nixon gave after Alger Hiss's conviction for perjury, for actually being a communist, lying about it, in just weeks before, was very much about the treason of the clerks. So it's about people like Alger Hiss, who had gone to the Harvard Law School and been a clerk to Felix Frankfurter and had risen up through the establishment. That's who McCarthy was aiming his attack on. I have never found a reference to the Rosenbergs in any of McCarthy's speeches. There were two people who would fit, I think, what most people imagine were casualties, if not precisely innocent victims of the Red Hunts. Here were these two people, Jewish Americans, living in Knickerbocker Village, wherever it was in New York City, and they're not making any money, and McCarthy goes after them. No, McCarthy didn't go after them. Mm-hmm. He went after Alger Hiss. He went after George Marshall. Mm-hmm. He went after, in an odd way, Eisenhower, went after the army. And that's what finished him off when Eisenhower had enough. He can call other people communists, but don't come after the army, because I come out of the army, and that finished him off. So there was a kind of anti-elitism in it, and the equivalence Joe drew, between the communists on the one hand and the liberal socialist do-gooders on the other. Well, that sounds familiar to us as well. Mm-hmm. I mean, that became essentially the argument of National Review. National Review was founded in part because McCarthy had lost, because Bill Buckley and others saw it as a failure of journalism. The liberals had controlled the debate, never again, which of course gives us a parallel with Fox much later. Mm-hmm. So there was definitely a strong anti-elitism in it, but you're absolutely right. McCarthy had an issue, and his issue was communists. Now you could also say Trump has an issue. It's aliens, illegal aliens, whether they are immigrants or Muslims. It's the outside. To some extent, he's got.
It's also American elites.
Oh, sure, yeah. Absolutely. It's always American elites.
Yeah,
that's really the Gary Wills point. It's always the elites you're going after, and the elites sometimes are asking for it, right? Gary Wills is no champion of the American.
Oh yeah, I mean that's the thing there are features of Trump's agenda that are a little tempting. I mean, I personally feel the American foreign policy establishment has not served the country well at all, and I mean that in a bipartisan way. Right. And Trump, he's not very articulate about it, but he's saying something like that, and it's not like he has any better ideas himself. But yeah, I mean, and if you look at domestic issues, I mean, a lot of people in his base have reason to think their interests have not been served particularly well by Democrats or Republicans, and immigration is not implausibly actually taken as as an example of that. And so it's not like there's no substance or logic to his appeal. It's not like it's all about hatred. And I also want to say one thing about relatedly, when you said if you go to a Trump rally, it's all about love. They love each other, right? I had a conversation on this show with a psychologist in Boston named Leanne Young, and she did the work that showed that it tends to be the case in conflict. She looked at Israel, Palestine, and I think one other case. Tends to be the case that each side says, the other side is motivated by hatred of us. We are motivated by love of each other.
Oh, interesting.
And so I'm looking at Trump. I'm tempted to exercise a little more caution before I conclude that they all hate the establishment and elites. And on the other hand, his rhetorical appeal, does seem to point in that direction, whatever the vibe you're picking up at the rallies.
Well, I think we talked about this, Bob, the first time we spoke, that with Trump, there is this hyperbolic, insulting, at times even profane, discourse we're simply not used to in politics. Yeah, well, Nixon in the White House tapes, maybe, talking to his friends.
Right, but this is in public.
Politics. And I think I make the point, because I've been thinking about this, and I do think it resurfaces, I see it again, that when you hear Trump supporters, Now, we're not talking about people who haven't made up their mind, but actual Trump supporters. And because you'll see them interviewed on television, they'll say, well, what do you think about that comment he made about Hillary or saying that, Obama is the author or whatever he said of ISIS, the inventor of ISIS. And they'll say, or mocking the reporter. I think you brought up.
Yeah, I brought that up in our last conversation. It continues to blow me away that did not end his campaign, but go ahead.
Well, it certainly didn't win him any new votes, right? But I think what some people say is, you know what? I kind of wish he wouldn't say that. You know? I don't like it. Oh, it's happened especially with the attack on the Khans, right? Now known to us all as the Gold Star. And no offense, to me that takes me back to the Diary of Anne Frank, but that's my own baggage. The Gold Star family, and they say, you know what? I kind of wish he wouldn't say that. I'd feel better if he didn't do it, right? But that doesn't mean they're going to dismiss him entirely because of it. And I think that's where we get a disconnect. And it seems to me, generally, we forgive, we extenuate for the people we agree with. You know, that extenuation is a kind of forgiveness that's colored by self-interest.
Right.
You forgive the person who's on your side. So I'm not really so shocked that people aren't appalled by that. I would be very surprised if somebody who hadn't made up his or her mind said, okay, I'm going for Trump because he just made fun of that reporter who's disabled. That would surprise me. But if somebody has decided Trump is saying the unsayable that needs to be said, well, the price of that is going to be now and again stepping over a line that we prefer not do. I think you can rationalize that.
Yeah, well, my view is mocking the disabled reporter did him no good whatsoever. On the other hand, his war on political correctness, things that might outrage liberal friends of ours, I think that did him a lot of good. Certainly in the beginning, in the primary, I think, and there we get to something that is ideological. It's not. I mean, we should probably distinguish between the resentment of elites broadly and the establishment broadly, and more ideological themes. And a war on political correctness, I think, is seen as a kind of an ideological thing that liberal identity politics, progressive identity politics have gotten obnoxious. There's just too much you can't say anymore, and that actually includes some. I take a little of this back because some parts of the speech code are embraced across the ideological spectrum by elites, but by and large, the war on political correctness seems to me more about a war on the left. But anyway, I'm just saying that I'd also say that if you're talking about when you personally, Sam Tanenhaus, talk to his supporters and they say, well, I kind of wish you wouldn't say that, I kind of wish you wouldn't say that, that your presence may be influencing their presentation of self there. I mean, they probably got a sense that you wouldn't say things like this, right? So that data may be slightly skewed, but in any event, that aside, I think there's no doubt that a lot of Americans are sick of political correctness, and that part leave us. I think the mocking of the disabled reporter is most interesting as just a statement on what a weird and disturbing character Trump himself is. I don't think it's a statement about his political appeal at all.
Oh, absolutely.
But the political correctness stuff, I think, is a big statement about his political appeal.
And it's so interesting. It must be really frustrating to to actual conservatives, let's say, because some of these things they've been saying for a long time too. Mm-hmm. Trump just takes it further than they do. Mm-hmm. Just like, remember, early on in the campaign, Trump would say, well, if it wasn't for me, nobody would be talking about immigration. Are you kidding? Talking about it for years and it really doesn't. But somehow Trump found a way to break through. Now, as far as the political correctness goes, I'm sure you've seen the notification. You good there? Yeah.
Yeah.
That the University of Chicago has sent out. Did you see this? Lind emailed it to me.
No.
The brilliant Mike Lind. I don't know but you know him.
I know Mike.
He's interesting because he thinks Trump actually. Mike is very theoretical, and he just thinks Trump could actually be the guy who gives you the New Deal. I don't know if he still thinks that, and he does it partly as a to be provocative.
A guy who opposes raising the minimum wage could give you the New Deal?
Well, that was before I started saying all that stuff, so I may not agree with it anymore. But here's the thing. Mike sent me a link. Apparently the University of Chicago has sent a notification out to first-year students saying we are not going to be as cautious and protective
Really?
as some other campuses are. People are allowed to express their opinions, including strong opinions. Speakers invited to campus will be allowed to speak, no matter what their point of view is. No one will be barred, as in famous cases where people either don't show up or they're booed off the stage, this kind of thing. And so there is this little backlash building. It's interesting that it should come from Chicago because it's kind of a citadel of a kind of anti-liberalism in a lot of ways.
Makes sense. Kind of.
But also citadel of academic freedom and all the rest. But so there I agree with you, Trump's onto something. Let me add one more layer to that, too, which is I've been trying to find a way in my mind to connect the geniality and friendliness of the people I saw, who, for instance, when Trump said to them, all the journalists in a back room in this long gym, it's a domed high school basketball gym, and Trump's at one end and we're at the opposite end, under one basket, he's under the other. And he said, and he was really angry at the Times at that point, and the Washington Post. And he says to the crowd, show them what you think. Kind of like the 1964 convention that Eisenhower made that comment about the journalists who were sowing hatred and all this. The people around us, the fans we'll call them, or the people attending the rally, kind of just smiled very sheepishly at us. I didn't feel any hostility.
You didn't?
No, it was. Now it might be up in the bleachers. There was these people closer who've been talking to some of us, and there was more of a sense of, well, this is the part we're playing in the show.
Right.
But so I'm trying to think through to some extent this geniality one will find, plus these attitudes that often can be and are described as kind of bigoted or at least exclusive, the whole alt-right identitarian politics thing. Maybe we can get into that a little bit.
Yes.
I think that's an important new thing, which also has antecedents we can talk about. But at any rate, and so one thing that occurred to me is, if you are at a Trump rally, and you really do come from the middle class. You're somebody my age, right? I'm born in 1955, so soon I'm going to turn 61. I'm an aging boomer, surrounded by other aging boomers. When they play, you can't always get what you want in a tape loop. Like, I remember where I was when I first heard it. This kind of thing. Okay, so many of these people, I'll include myself because I'm there, are actually not so badly off. Okay, so we're not the working poor, let's say, who are really, really struggling, as so many people are in small towns in the Midwest, in cities, in Connecticut, where I live, all these places. But maybe you worry about your kids or your grandchildren. Because what you might see, if you went to the DNC as I did, and sat, I'm a lowly freelancer now, so I don't get to the fancy time stamp the way I used to. And I'm sitting there, up in the third deck, of this huge basketball arena, the 76ers never fill, I'm sure. And they bring out one speaker after another early in the day, long before prime time, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. And it's always somebody who has a resume like Mother Teresa's with a law degree from Harvard, And here we're going to present somebody who's for Hillary, who's such an amazing story on her own. She comes from a poor, undocumented family, but after she aced the SATs, and you get this kind of perfect story. And you might think, if you are someone who will end up in that Mechanicsburg rally, nobody's doing that for my kid exactly. Now, the answer would be, yeah, because for the first 400 years of our history, it was your group that got ahead. Except, as Obama so brilliantly said all those years ago, when he gave, I have to get rid of something on the screen here, when he gave that remarkable speech on race in Philadelphia, after the Reverend Wright issue, My favorite part of that speech is when he does a Pat Moynihan riff. And he says, and Obama says, look, if you are a white person who's a second or third generation immigrant, you don't actually think that you're to blame for slavery. You
Right.
don't keep anybody down. Of course, he's right about that. So I think part of it is what's called anger and hatred and resentment by the newsroom of the Washington Post or the New York Times, many of whom are like Rhodes scholars, right off the campuses of the Ivy League. What's called that is also, it's a kind of yearning or nostalgia. Mark Lola has this phrase. I'm writing about Mark Lola now. The politics of nostalgia. It's a kind of sense that something's been lost.
Yeah.
Something that used to be in the culture that isn't there anymore, and what was so awful about it,
Yeah, there's
that sometimes gets missed.
There's a line near the end of your piece, something about, I don't have it here, but it's something about, when was America great? It's something about, what is the answer? It's
great whenever you last felt young.
Whenever you last felt young or
something.
Yeah,
because you're thinking, well, what does he mean? Does he mean the 1950s? And, Yuval Levin does this riff on how, Yuval, who edits National Affairs, very clever, brilliant guy, and does a riff on how Charles Murray and Paul Krugman sometimes sound alike. They both choose the year 1963 and say America was terrific then. Mm-hmm. And Yuval says, disagrees. But I think there's a tendency to look at Trump and say, well, what does he mean when he says, when was it last great? In fact, I think I just saw a poll that said, maybe it was Vox or 538, that said 50 years ago or even Pew, they charted on a poll. But I think it's a more emotional, personal thing than that. You remember when life was better, And part of Trump's extraordinary quality, and it's not him, he could be somebody else. Because I take the view that he's not, I think I said this in the piece, he's less tribune than he is surrogate for people's view. He's not leading them anywhere. He's following.
No.
And it's this idea that, I remember a time when things were better. And many of us feel that, especially as we get older. And that's what you see in the rally.
Yeah, it's a natural, probably part of aging. And then I guess in a certain demographic, it mixes in with this observation that your kids are not going to have the same kind of opportunities as the kids of some people you're seeing on TV or you're reading about or whatever.
Yeah, the culture's not geared for them. Listen, I will tell you something. Maybe I shouldn't say it.
Then definitely say it.
Okay. When I was at the Times, I was at the Times twice, but once just where I was kind of in and out. I got past the revolving door. But then I was there for quite a while, from 2004 to 2014. I was there for 10 years. And at one point, I was at the book review, and the deputy editor and I was the editor, were talking with an editor at the paper who was kind of overlooking what they call, chutes and ladders, promotion, and, hiring, this kind of thing. And she said to us, what do you think of X? And I'm not going to identify X. It's not fair to him. And she said, and we said, well, he's good. He's written for us. And I think he's a really good young writer. And she said, well, let me put it to you this way. If I'm going to hire one white guy this year, should it be him?
Uh-huh.
Okay. And I respected the candor in that, but I was also a little taken aback by it. Now, that doesn't mean they hired only one white person this year.
Right.
It meant that's how the question is being framed.
Mm-hmm.
And now that's the New York Times, and the New York Times has got a lot of history to compensate for. If you dig in the archives, as I do for the history work, you're not going to find a ton of female bylines, before a certain time. All that is true and understood. Nevertheless, if it's your son, say, who wants to get into journalism, you might be taken aback by that, And I think that's where we're getting at the political correctness and also the sense of who really composes the establishment. One reason the neocons in particular, I think, were just irate about Obama is because he combines the two groups they attack. Mm-hmm. One is the Ivy League elite, and the other is like the undeserving poor, the underclass. And Obama brought them together. He's the guy from the disadvantaged background who's the editor of the Harvard Law Review, and that ease he had to them feels fake and false. I don't know if you've looked at J.D. Vance's book or heard him talk about.
I've heard him talk
for an election. Or you remember, Bob, one of the points he makes is the way Obama and Clinton speak. It's not the way people talk out in the heartland,
right.
of Iowa, Appalachia, or wherever. Trump, the thing that bothers many or some about Trump, what I've called these kind of Molly Bloom-like soliloquies. You never get a completed sentence,
right.
and the verbs are the wrong verbs. The words are in the wrong place. Well, you know what? That's how most people talk. And I'll add something. When you're I think I tweeted this when I was in Mechanicsburg. Actually, when you hear him in person, it sounds much more coherent because you pick up the atmosphere of the room and you realize he's responding to it. So when he hops from point to point, it actually does not sound as deranged as it does when you read it in a transcript.
So you mentioned the term alt-right, and that's a term I had never heard of 3 months ago, and now it's a big thing, especially in light of the new the chief executive, I guess is the term for Trump's campaign. It's unclear who's really going to be in charge. There's a new campaign manager, new chief executive, but the new chief executive, I guess his name's Bannon, right? Comes from Breitbart, was running Breitbart after Breitbart himself died, and so now there's a lot of speculation about whether Breitbart is going to infuse the campaign maybe more explicitly with white nationalism and alt-right generally. I mean, maybe we should start out by trying to make sense of this concept alt-right. So it has been associated with white nationalism, with anti-Semitism, with misogyny, with to put it mildly, a strong reaction against political correctness, a suspicion of many so-called conservatives as not, in fact, being true to the faith, and so on. What else would you add to the characterization of alt-right? And then I'd like to hear your views on what connection it does have to Breitbart as that site now exists, and so on.
Well, here's where I'm really going to give myself away as a geek for this stuff. I'm probably like one of 8 people in the world who will say the most exciting thing about this election, about the Republican side of it, has been the reemergence of what for many years was called the old right, capital O, capital R. And it's essentially the pre-World War II isolationist right.
That's Father Coughlin.
It's Father Coughlin. But here's what's interesting about it, Bob, is it actually resurfaced after World War II and then was pushed away. It was pushed to the margin. Mm-hmm. And it was Bill Buckley and company who essentially did it in National Review, although not initially. Bill himself, I don't want to give too much of this away because, as you know, I'm writing his biography. Bill Buckley actually was a product of the old right. Mm-hmm. His father had the classic views we now associate with the John Birch Society. Anti-Semitism, even though the Birchers were not officially anti-Semitic, and in fact Welch tried to bring Jews in. But that, again, we associate with that kind of nativist conservatism. The Buckley family was steeped in that. And when National Review started, some of its big supporters, advisors, and such came out of this older isolationist right wing that did have, and I will call it a nationalist or ethnic identity. Though Bill was Catholic, which is very important. Many National Review editors were. But that was not so much the issue because race hadn't become an issue until the Brown decision. And then you actually see the right sorting itself out. National Review was pro-white South, which I think many people know. And I've written about this. And some challenged it at the time and thought I hadn't produced enough evidence. In fact, there's vastly more than I read. It was not a lack of evidence. On the contrary, there's a great deal of it that shows they were very tied to the arguments of John C. Calhoun and states' rights. They were very big on an old-style politics that included racial prejudice, some degree, depended on who was involved, anti-Semitism, and they kind of pushed it to the margins. And it was really Bill's colleague James Burnham who told him, "We don't want to mess with all of this. You're going to be known by the company you keep." He said this very directly to Bill. And so keep away from the it's a Jewish European conspiracy to get us involved in foreign wars argument, which was very much rampant then. There's a document you can find on Google the FBI put together. It begins from the early 50s about something called the Congress of Freedom, which was an umbrella of really super conservative, what were then called Americanist or also patriotic and nationalist groups. There was a battle in the 50s. That's what the conservative ideological war was about. Do we let those people in? Will those people drag us down? That's why in the end, although it took them quite a while, Buckley and Company finally drove out the Birchers. At first, they did not want to do that. They wanted them all in. And Bill thought he could keep everyone together. And then it just got pushed too far. It became too extreme. It was costing them in the eyes of the establishment. Mm-hmm. That's why if you read someone like Samuel Francis, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's very big now on the alt-right. That's what I'm getting to. These are the progenitors. A young guy named Tim Schenck at Columbia, a student of Eric Foner's, wrote a long piece in The Guardian. He talked to me he talked to some other people about the connections between the alt-right and this earlier phase of conservatism, which never went completely away. Pat Buchanan, Joe Sobran at National Review is another one. It is often, in the current term of art, identitarian for sure, and it combines a lot of Trump stuff. It's
so wait,
not
identitarian means, I mean, I ask because there's also the phrase identity politics referring to people on the left. So what is identity?
It's their version of it.
So it's the right way. It's white identity politics.
That's it. White identity politics. And it's often, I follow some on Twitter, and some of these, I know it's surprising, but some of the people involved are incredibly smart. You know, there's this guy, Richard Spencer, I think his name, who's an advanced degree from the University of Chicago. And he does the journal Radix, right? Radicalism, Roots. That's about all of this. It's root conservatism. And it's coming back in. It's gaining some traction again. This is where the big battle is going on. I don't know why I'm not seeing more of Pat Buchanan, because he was a herald of a lot of this.
Well, he's getting up there in the years. I don't know how old he is now, but...
Well, Pat was born, I think, in 1938.
Yeah.
So, and he's older for sure, and he was in MSNBC for a while, and then, they fired him. Yeah. But he's somebody who's a forerunner. Samuel Francis, who was at Washington Times, I think, was kind of an intellectual mentor to Buchanan, who's also extremely well-read, by the way. And this group was spoiling for a fight for a really long time. They hated the neocons, the American conservative magazine, which many now think. I know Mark Lillett and Andrew Sullivan think this. It's the best conservative magazine being published now.
Yeah, it's interesting to compare that with Breitbart, right? I mean, the American Conservative, it's a cerebral magazine that I don't think flirts with... you tell me.
No, not at all.
But it's not really flirting with a white nationalist with the alt-right stuff, so far as I know. It's a pretty, and it's a magazine of ideas. You turn to Breitbart, and first of all, just superficially, it's like a hate tabloid. It's just like the headlines are unbelievable. It's just a complete propaganda operation stylistically, and then ideologically. I assume you're going to tell me that there's a much closer affiliation there with white nationalism and all the things that I associated with the alt-right, right?
Well, I do not pretend to be an expert on Breitbart. I don't know people there. I read it some. And you will see the mix. There are some, very clever, intelligent pieces, some not so much, some that are more provocative and emotional. And the fact is, we're living in an era now where there's not a lot of censorship. It's funny, we complain, and many on the right certainly do, complain about political correctness, and yet we are living in this uncensored time. To me, I'm going to be writing about this. I just feel we're living in the American Weimar. We have for a really long time. Richard Rorty said this almost 20 years ago, that America is starting to feel a little like the Weimar Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mean, Hitler is going to start marching.
No, but it's still not an auspicious comparison.
Well, and yet look what Weimar gave us too. It gave us brilliant thinkers and writers. You have the highly problematic case of Heidegger, but Heidegger's nonetheless a genius, and Jaspers and Arendt and Walter Benjamin and Franz Rosen, Krantz and all
some
these
of
people.
whom had to flee ultimately, but fine, yeah.
Yeah, Thomas Mann. I mean, it's extraordinary. And we have our own three-penny opera now. It's called Hamilton. And so there's a kind of liberalization of the culture. There's a sense that the taboos have been shattered, and that beneath the surface there's this counter action. I'm learning this from Mark Lilla, because I think that's...
Yeah, and I think you have to ask whether in this case, I think with Germany it was very much circumstantially driven, the aftermath of World War I and so on, but I think in this case you have to ask yourself how much it was technologically driven. I mean, you and I were, when we were young, the establishment had a relatively easy time of it. There were only 3 TV networks. They were answerable to the Federal Communications Commission, and video's a very powerful medium. Now, the print was somewhat more diffuse in its power structure than video and than radio, but not a whole lot, because the economics had narrowed down the number of newspapers in the average city to a couple. So, I mean, you compare that to today, and it's just a totally different technological environment, and I think that's... And Trump is, in a way, a good example. I mean, how did he, he uses Twitter, he made his name in, reality TV, which is, to a large extent, I think, technologically embedded, the way all cable channels are kind of technologically embedded compared to what was available in the old broadcast days. So I wonder whether, we haven't seen the most dramatic phase of this yet, in part because... on the one hand, I do think elites ultimately regroup in history, and even when you can argue that some of the threat to their power is technologically driven, it kind of tends to happen. On the other hand, information media in our lifetime have in some respects tremendously decentralized the distribution of power, and it's just harder to for elites to maintain a speech code or any other consensus.
All that's very interesting, and I'll add a couple of things. If you go back and nose around in Weimar culture, you see how much of it was about striking music, striking visuals, magazines with brilliant new fonts. It's a slightly different culture. It's not as sped up as ours is, but it seemed to be a break from what went before. Brecht theater was a startling break from conventional theater of the time. And but another thing I'd say about elites too, and I go to my my idol Gary Wills again, is this fantastic essay he wrote in the Sunday Times magazine in January 1998. And I remember for 2 reasons. One, I had just started working at the op-ed page. There was an editor, and not the columnists don't get editors. I worked with you. We did a piece or two of yours when I was at the op-ed page. I'm quite sure. And also, though, it was the week the Monica Lewinsky case really broke. And Gary happened to write a piece that had obviously been written weeks before, even at his breakneck speed. Monica's not in it, so it proceeded that. Whatever happened to politics, and he makes 2 arguments in it. One is that America's history is to become more and more egalitarian. And that the idea of an elite was really a temporary one. That it came in after World War II, when we had our group of wise men, emphasis men, and we know who they were. Walter Isaacson and Evan Thomas wrote a book about them. McCloy and Kennan and Boland and people like that, Atchison and Marshall. This sort of great group of people who led us into our international phase and all the rest. And Wilson's very critical of them. And he says, well, what else do we know about them? Well, we know that the most brilliant and certainly the most literary of them, George Kennan, really was a racist. I mean, you read his diaries and it's there. They're very elitist. They're very old school. They're very snobbish, and not snobbish only toward African Americans. The hint of anti-Semitism in Kennan. And Will says, no, that's not really the tradition in our culture. The tradition is more Jeffersonian, of a kind of constant egalitarianism. And the more egalitarian we become, the better. And his other point is, a lot of it doesn't happen in Washington. It happens out there in the country. And that, I think, is one of the things I credit the Tea Party movement for, is reminding people how local politics can be. You know what? You're not going to get the Supreme Court to overturn Roe v. Wade, but you could, and I am totally pro-choice. But if you're not pro-choice and you're stringently Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz-like on these issues, well, we know there are a lot of states that are passing those laws. Mm-hmm. Now, is that a good thing? To my mind, no. But in terms of democracy, it does restore some you decentralize the power again in a way that parallels what you're talking about with media. Mm-hmm. So that's why I think in some ways, all this we're going through now could really be pretty good for democracy. One more thing, and then I want to hear what you have to say. We mentioned George Wallace before. Well, I was doing some research. Kathy, my wife, helped me do it. I may write a piece on Gore Vidal. His papers have become available. There's some interesting stuff. And Vidal, of course, is a big fight with Bill Buckley, and I certainly want to use that material for the Buckley biography. But I was also looking at Vidal himself. And some will remember there was a famous debate, televised debate between Gore and Bill, 1968, during the two conventions, and they called each other names, ugly names. Vidal called Buckley a crypto-Nazi. Buckley called Vidal a queer. All this was said on television, those three networks you're talking about. And it was a huge eruption, and they sued and countersued, and it dragged on for years. And it was a very ugly moment in our politics, and some have said, including the filmmakers who did the documentary Best of Enemies, this is the beginning of the kind of polarization and shout fest of our politics. But what was interesting when I was going through the documents was to see the other stuff Vidal was doing at the same time. When he was in Chicago having a debate with Bill Buckley, he was also meeting with what were already the remnants of the Eugene McCarthy campaign to try to create a new party. There was a party called the Peace and Freedom Party that attracted people from the right and the left. And there was another one, they were going to call it the New Party. And it was going to be a fourth party in our politics. And if you, because George Wallace was leading the third party. And if you go back and listen to the Vidal and Buckley debates, he made these references I never understood to third and fourth parties. I thought, why is he saying that? It makes him look naive. Well, it's because he was getting involved with them. Well, 1968 was as horrific a year as we've had in our modern history. Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy were both assassinated within 2 months. It was shocking. There were riots in both convention cities, first Miami and then Chicago. It was a nightmare. And yet, there was all this democratic ferment. Out of it came the primary system we have now. Without which primary system, you wouldn't have Donald Trump. You also wouldn't have Bernie Sanders doing stuff they did. But America democratized even at this frightening moment. And I wonder if we look at what's going on now, and what do we see? The Republican Party, for one, can no longer skate along on this antique, this barnacled Reaganite ideology. Nobody's buying it anymore. They're finally having to face up to it. And it's their own voters that are making them do it. It's their own base out there in Mississippi, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, where I live, in San Juan Insular. It's actually forcing a change. 17 people ran for president. It sounds crazy. What does it mean? Well, what you said before. The party doesn't have control over this. The elites really maybe ceding some of that power.
Yeah. No, I think so, and I think it may be a long-term thing. So we've been at this a little more than an hour or so. We're going to have to bring it to an end, I want to close with one more question, though. As I recall during our last conversation many months ago, and correct me if I'm wrong, first of all, you were contemplating the prospect of a Trump presidency with not that much alarm. We were talking about, like, what if he actually became president? And I think you were saying, I can imagine things working out fine. I'm wondering whether first of all, if I'm wrong, correct me. But in any event, tell me what your current view is, whether your view has changed, what your current view is on whether it's an alarming prospect.
I think I'm afraid it is, and I'm used to being wrong all the time. So that's the reason. What's scary about it is not so much the ideology. I think a lot of that would go away. Like many others, I was really struck by that great story Jane Mayer had in the New Yorker where she interviewed Trump's ghostwriter, Tony Schwartz.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, and he just described what it's like to be in his presence. Now, maybe it's that journalistic narcissism because it's another writer who said it. I found it convincing. But it is scary to think that someone with so little discipline, also, I think, and this will sound naive on my part not to have realized it sooner, but as Scott Fitzgerald said, a writer should be unwary, is I think Trump really does not respect democracy. All that talk about rigged elections, that really bothers me. Mm-hmm. You have to go in there and respect the system. This is the complaint conservatives have made forever about the left and liberals, is they don't respect our institution. Mm-hmm. Here is somebody who's actually saying, if I don't win, it's because they're cooking the books against me. The voter ID thing, I hate the idea that it's meant to do anything other than keep poor people of color from voting. You'll never persuade me it has any purpose other than that. Mm-hmm. That's where they pursue it. It's in those states. It's been overturned in state after state. There's no record or history that you can count, on more than one hand of voter fraud being perpetrated. And Trump is supporting it. Saying, we have to have voter ID and all the rest. Those things really do concern me. What I thought for a time was when he was doing more of what Mike Lynn saw as described as a kind of almost a new deal, new deal. That we are going to look after poor people. We are going to protect some jobs. We are going to make sure there's health care. When he was really breaking with conservative and Republican orthodoxy, mm-hmm. I thought, well, here's a guy who maybe can make it work. When people like Dole and Fred Lott like it. But now I think, he's kind of crazy.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, I think the lack of self-control is just kind of stunning. And we'll see. As we tape this, he seems to be in a phase of relative self-control, but it's only been a few days now, and we'll see whether the new campaign team can get him to stick with this. And even this has had lapses when I think of it, tweets that were probably ill-advised within the last 72 hours. So,
yeah, I haven't followed that close. Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
One reason this is so important, and I think liberals and Democrats get this, and Republicans don't, is I still think Ted Cruz is worse. And I think a lot of people do.
I agree with you that Ted Cruz is scary in part because he's smarter and more skillful than Trump. And in fact, a question we will have to save for a whole nother day is, imagine if the embodiment of the movement that Trump is now the embodiment of were a more skilled operator than Trump is.
We may see one.
That's
what we all should be looking at.
Yeah.
Trump is not Trump. Trump is a
right.
What smart person?
Right.
What smart 32-year-old who's real or 22-year-old who's really getting into politics with the mindset of a social media era person, a millennial watching this, is filtering out all the crazy. Okay, but Trump, that doesn't work. You can't call people names. Yeah. I'm 30. I don't have a problem with marriage equality, and not that Trump really does either, but he'll play to a lot of that. Or certainly not, don't have racial issues. You get rid of all of that.
Respect Gold Star families. Don't make fun of disabled people. It's not that, it wouldn't take a genius to do a better job than Trump has done of mobilizing, of taking this to the next level.
I think that's right. And I think that's what everybody should be looking at. I would love to find the person out there or the thinker. It doesn't have to be a politician. It could be, say, the Bill Buckley to Barry Goldwater, the really smart writer and thinker. And if you're out there, let me know, and I will profile you, whoever you are. It'd be great if it was a woman or a person of color for Vanity Fair, because I think they'll publish it.
Yeah.
I just think that's what we should be looking at now. It's less about him and more about the movement.
Yeah. Which is not to discount the idea that he could win the election. He's close enough in the polls so that could happen. I think that would largely be an indictment of Hillary Clinton if it did. But in any event,
it's the word, isn't it? I mean, there was all this legal stuff with her.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. She's a highly problematic candidate. Anyway, thanks for being with us. So people should Google your name and prospect to see your ongoing columns. I mean, I would call them more like essays than columns.
Yeah, they're both. I do both. I do features and I do little columns. And I've been writing in a lot of different places, Bob. So people can just look it up.
Okay. Google your name. And also, where can they find you on Twitter? What's your Twitter handle?
It's at Sam Tanenhaus.
Okay, one word. No
one word.
Okay. Well, thanks, Sam. I hope you'll be able to check back in with us a few months down the road and see if the Republic has survived.
It's always fun talking to you, Bob.
Okay. Take care.
You too. Goodbye.